When we go about setting up dimensions themselves, we give them a dimension ID. Now that dimension ID can either be a generic ID or it can be a specific ID. Here we can see I've set up some dimensions under classes, and I've just given them specific IDs in relation to the types of dimensions they are. That doesn't mean to say that you can't use generic, and more commonly I would probably use a generic dimension, and using a generic dimension allows you to be more adaptable with the dimensions that you're setting up. The names of dimensions can always be changed, but the actual dimension ID, once it's been set up, cannot be changed. So looking at our specific event codes that we've set up here, you can see that I have added a suffix to the dimension code. Sorry, I'll just pop back to that quickly. And that's in line with the event that I've set up. So I've got an event 1, and then I've got a double C1 for accommodation, and so on. But we've done this to allow us to enable what we call parent-child relationships between the dimensions. This allows us to say, have a hierarchy of dimensions. So we've got events at the top level of our dimension there. We've then got event 1, which again is a parent. And underneath event 1, we've got 3 subdimensions. So these we'd call child dimensions. And each of these child dimensions are the active dimensions that we'd use when we're posting transactions. The other 2 dimensions, which are parent dimensions, we'll set up as active non-posting dimensions. That means they'll still be visible to us, but we won't be able to post transactions to them. So when we set up the status of the dimension, we either set them up as active or active non-posting, depending on whether we want to use them just in reporting or whether we actually want to use them to capture transactions directly into them. Let's have a look and see how this actually works in the system itself when we go about setting it up. So I'm just going to switch quickly into Sage Intacct. And in here, I'm going to go to my reports, setup, and in this case, I'm going to go to classes. Under classes here, we can see our different event classes that we had set up. But rather than use this one, I want to go about setting up a new dimension. And I'm going to set up a dimension. And I'm going to call this one CONF for conferences. I've got a dimension description I can use for additional descriptions. This particular dimension is going to be a header dimension, so it's going to be a parent, so I'm not going to associate with an existing parent ID, but I'm going to make this dimension active non-posting. So I'll save that, jump out of there. You'll see now I've got a conferences dimension, and I want to add a further dimension, and this one I'm going to call CONF1, and I'll call this 24. And I'll make the parent dimension conferences, and I'll leave that as my active dimension. You'll see we're just about to have a look at this. I've also got another field down here that I've added. This is a custom field called class type. So we can set up custom fields in the system to work just about anywhere throughout Sage Intacct. And in this case, I've made this a pick list custom field. So I've already populated it with these fields. If I want to use any of these custom fields in association with this dimension, I can come and choose them. So I'll just choose catering here as an example and save that dimension. We can now see that I've got my parent dimension, and underneath that, I've got my conferences 2024 dimension. If you're not seeing this in this format, you might be seeing it looking like this. Have a look for your display hierarchy button, and that will then give you a better view of your actual dimensions. Let's switch back to our slides. So moving on from there, I mentioned the custom fields. So we can set up custom fields. In this case, I set up my class type custom field to use specifically with classes. And I could then add those classes to those class types to my dimensions. And the reason that we do this is to allow us to filter more carefully on our dimensions when we're adding these dimensions to dimension groups, as I mentioned earlier, and we'll have a look at that in a bit more detail once we get into dimension groups. A few other considerations with your setup of dimensions. Different dimensions have different properties. So for example, your department dimension Doesn't have any entity restrictions. So if you set up a department dimension at a sub-entity level, at an entity level, I should say, that dimension will be seen by all entities and at top level. You can also set up department managers for your department dimension, and users can also be restricted by department. This is quite important because this is the only dimension that has this feature, which means that if you're looking at it from a permissions point of view and you want to limit access to specific departments, you can use that in the setup, but this is the only dimension that you can do that with. So there we can see I've set up an administration dimension and I've set up a manager for that dimension. And then in my user setup, I've got user departments, so I can link users to specific departments. Location dimensions, they are restricted to specific entities. So when you set up a location dimension, you're saying which entity it belongs to. You do have user restrictions with location dimensions, but that is just purely based on the entity that user has access to. Other standard dimensions, they can be restricted to entity level. So if I go and set up a dimension at entity level, it will only be usable by that entity. As I mentioned, there's no user restrictions available. Having a quick look at that, if I go and look at any one of these entities, any one of these classes, you'll see that I don't have the ability to set this up, set any managers up or anything else for the class. And in addition, if I go to an entity level, let me go to SDMO2 in this case. And if I was to set up a new entity at this level, I'm just going to call this one SDMO. I'll see that for this entity, but if I go to my entity 1, I won't see that class at this entity. So just bear that in mind. The other thing, as I mentioned, if you're looking at your users, if I add a new user, you can see that we can limit users to specific entities and to departments, but that's all we can use. Okay, that's the only two dimensions in effect that we can limit users by.